June 1977, I, KeithTyler, is being interviewed by John Belland as a part of the ECT Foundation Oral History Project. We are being recorded in a faculty office on the campus of The Ohio State University, Columbus, Ohio. Keith, it seems strange for me to be interviewing you, an old pro interviewer from with years and years of experience, but perhaps...
I was a Methodist minister at that time, and about a couple of months after I was born, we moved to Peru, Nebraska, which is also in the south. There were 8 born in our family, 1 child born after I was born, who died in birth. We reached the national average for infant mortality in those days. There were 8 children born, 4 survived, and those who survived were all males.
Mm-hmm.
I was the youngest that lived.
Uh-huh. That was a time in Nebraska of...
and things were comfortable, but of course everyone, by today's standards, was quite poor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether you want me to go into the fact of how my folks happened to be living in Nebraska, but
it'd be interesting.
The point is that my father was raised in Illinois, and then his family moved to Nebraska as homesteaders,
Mm-hmm.
and he and his brother went to rural schools in age to my father, whose name was William, or Bill. No, they called him Willie, I guess, but anyway. They saw a notice in a post office at what is now George Washington University and put themselves through medical school. Both of them became MDs.
Mm-hmm.
And then they went back to Nebraska. My father, meanwhile, getting married in Washington to the daughter of a police judge there, a man very high in the G, and he decided he had the call to be a minister. And so he pulled up stakes and went back to Evanston, Illinois, where he attended the... that is quite right. And he attended and was graduated from this, and of course in the process became a liberal and intellectual. I mean, he studied Old Testament in the best sense of scholarship and all this. My brother Ralph was... By the way, that was before my time. My brother Ralph was born in Chicago while they were in Evanston. And anyway, that was a period of great hardship because he was trying to support them on maybe a girl to support, to take care of. Well, anyway, after he got his BD, Bachelor of Divinity, they went back to Nebraska. Since built up in the early days.
I remember asking either your brother Ralph or yourself one time, why so many leaders...
Family. And there are lots of upward mobile people, and you wanted to get out of farming or get out of day labor. Mm-hmm. The only feasible route really was education. And so Nebraska, and I guess Indiana too, and Iowa, those states produced a great many future, what became leaders in mm-hmm. education in the United States. Right. It was mainly because it was a route out. Mm-hmm. Now, the Dust Bowl may have accentuated this later, but this was a phenomenon going on all during that period as people, I suppose you'd say they had rising expectations. They became literate, they read, they wanted to do things, they wanted to get out where there was opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so they tended to go to Lincoln or to a bigger city first and then go east. Right. That seemed to be the land of opportunity. By the way, later, after the Dust Bowl, the tendency was all to move to California. Right. You know, they have an annual Iowa picnic, but they're all...
elementary and secondary education in that lab school of the normal
No,
school?
I lived in Peru, Nebraska, Hastings, Nebraska, and I had mm-hmm. my first years of schooling in Hastings. That, by the way, had a college, Hastings mm-hmm. College. Mm-hmm. The college was Presbyterian. My father turned Congregational, and I suppose this has something to do with the general spirit of independence among the Tyler boys, but he didn't like being what he called kicked around by presiding elders or bishops who determined where you would have your next pastorate. Right. And he had too much independence, and so he scouted around, and an opening came in Hastings, Nebraska at a Congregational church, and he was given a call, and we lived in Hastings for 2 years. The first Congregational church there, a very interesting period. I guess that was when I was about from 6 to 8 or 7 to 9 or something of that sort. And then we moved to Crete, Nebraska, which again was a Congregational college, a Doane college, established by my father became state superintendent of Congregational churches, which occurred in 1920, I guess. I didn't tell you when I was born, which was 1905. So we moved to Lincoln when I was 15 and a senior in high school.
And then you went right on to the University of Nebraska?
Well, I had my final year of high school from age 15, 16 in Lincoln. And this was another interesting thing. People today think that modern schools, you know, exist only today. Well, this was a very large metropolitan high school. Lincoln only had one high school. There were 3,600 students in this one high school, but they had all sorts of experimentation. They had supervised study. We had double periods, 2 45-minute periods together. So you had both study and recitation, and then we had only 4 periods a day with a floating period. So each class met only 4 times a week, and then there was some news writing. We had a class in learning to appreciate good magazines, in which, believe it or not, the textbook was Harper's, Scribner's, the Forum, magazines of this kind, and so on. I mean, it was a very modern kind of high school. All kinds of extracurricular activities, a swimming pool in the high school, and this was back in 1920-21.
Sure.
Well, I simply mentioned it. Then, indeed, from there, I went on to the University of Nebraska, originally resolved not to be a teacher. I had 3 brothers all in the teaching or educational game, and of course I didn't want to do that. That would be following in their footsteps. Again, I suppose this independence bit. Also, I got a little turned on religiously in terms of broad religious movements of the time. Here, convention. This was a kind of a student missionary movement of Sherwood Eddy and people of that sort. But they had Bishop Stuart Kennedy from, I think that's the name, I'm not quite sure, but from England, very broad-minded Anglican liberal, and all kinds of leaders of this time. Here were 4,000 or 5,000 college students in the not only did we have a kind of movement to re-Christianize the so-called heathen world, but much more important, I think, was the fact that they began to tackle modern problems, and this got me turned on. So when I did finish college, well, in my junior year, I decided that puttering around with journalism, which I did, and taking a liberal arts college wasn't enough. I got a little panicky. What in the world was I going to do to earn a living? I didn't want to continue in a dance orchestra, which is how I earned all my spending money in clothes. So what to do? And so I decided, well, I'll take a few education courses just as a safeguard. And of course, actually, I loved it. And then they, indeed, I did some early practice teaching because they needed this done in science. And apparently I did so well that then the physics department wanted to hire me to teach this is while I was an undergraduate, teach a section of physics. And I was supposed to be a science teacher. And the university school needed an extra teacher and so forth. So I got really engaged in this thing, and I loved every minute of it. And in the summers, so I got turned on to education, but kind of a religious bent. And after teaching a year following university graduation, I think I have my timing right. It might be that this came first and teaching later. But anyway, I did go back to Yale Divinity School to take religious education, not to go into the ministry, but doing education, but with a different slant. My major professor at Yale Divinity School was Luther Weigel. Now, Luther Weigel that time was professor of religious education, but he's a scholar, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
That was a good experience being with him. Well, what
Then
more?
you
I'm
moved-
talking too
yeah,
much.
No, you saved me asking some questions that I would have had to ask. You then went to Teachers College, Columbia. Was that immediately after the?
No,
community
after a
school?
year in Yale. And by the way, I suppose I went to Yale because I could get the best deal financially there.
Mm-hmm.
They had various aids, and of course I worked also always.
Sure.
I had very little help from anyone. There wasn't much to be had. I suppose one should put in these little incidents. I woke up one morning in Yale, I suppose it was February or maybe March, and I had a severe pain in my lower right quadrant of my belly.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't stand the pain, and so I walked over, as early as they opened, I walked over to the health place and found out that I had acute appendicitis, and they immediately ordered me into the New Haven hospital, and the Yale medical staff operated for an acute attack of appendicitis.
Mm-hmm.
Well and good, but the point is then this cost what then was a fantastic amount of $100.
Right.
Or some such. I don't know exactly what it cost, but I do remember that Dean Charles Reynolds Brown, a very interesting figure who was dean of the Divinity School and also a famous preacher, walked into my hospital room and handed me a check, personal check for $100, and said, well, this is my contribution to the Lord, or some such. But the point was that he knew our financial status, and he simply wanted to do this. And I said, well, you can't do this and all this, but he was very happy to do it. But these little things are very interesting, and
that kind of concern for students, and just even for a dean or a director to know his students well enough.
That's right. If you want, I don't know how much in depth you want me to go, but if you want to reflect, here I was raised in the Middle West, first small town, and then a medium-sized city where I'd played in a dance orchestra and supposedly was becoming fairly sophisticated. But to those of us in that part of the country, the East was the great unknown. It was sophistication. It's where all the great shows came from, where styles came from. Remember, this is before radio and television. And there was a great cultural lag between what you had in the big cities and what you had in the Midwest. We were, in a sense, right off the farm. And here I was going back east, and my mother had been educated in New England at a finishing school, and it was a different life. And so here I went to Yale, and the great seat of culture and learning, you see. And it really was an education just to live in a different part of the country, to see, for example, while I'd been raised in a town of Crete, which had 2/3 foreign immigrant settlers, mostly what we call Bohemian or Czech, plus some German. Nevertheless, that was a kind of a homogenized culture. But to go to New Haven, where there was a great influx of Italians and various other ethnic groups, and to see the conditions there, and then with my divinity brothers going and visiting speakeasies and seeing people drinking beer, I mean all these working people, and seeing how it served to function as a kind of club, whereas in Nebraska we accepted the fact that the state was dry. I mean good people didn't do these things.
Right.
But here we were seeing a whole other side of life. It was a great, he's thrown in where he will be thrown into relationship with all kinds of new forces and influences and personalities and people.
Not all, in fact, maybe the most important education is the informal kind of thing that occurs in the
all of them, Bridgeport, but also they were all interconnected with interurbans. And I used to, on a Friday afternoon, get on a streetcar and go to one of these. It was a tremendous experience, and even if I didn't always interact with people because I didn't have any common bonds, I at least observed them and did what I could. And well, that was only 1 year, but it was profound, really, part of my education.
Well, and what happened right after that?
Well, then I went back to Lincoln, Nebraska, and taught my first real year of teaching after all this student teaching, and became a science teacher in what then was University Place High School, a separate community, later taken into Lincoln and became Northeast High School, I guess. But anyway, I taught in that science, physics. I also taught one class in news writing, and I guess another class in English. I don't remember. We
fascinating.
have to do all sorts of things.
Nowadays, they sort of assume that scientists are illiterate or something.
Right. Well, I was also a sponsor of the High Y Club in the school, and had all kinds of informal relationships that way. And while it was near home, I got a room locally and lived there, and went home 10 miles away on weekends, yeah. And continued once in a while to play in a dance band, which was in a Presbyterian church for which I got paid. That's liberal for you.
Right.
And various other things. Managed to make a go of it the first year. Want me to drag in something else?
Yeah,
because all these things are interrelated. I like to tell my students that anything happens to you, and that's why he used to hire union students to do a lot of this, taking clubs and things in the place. And while I was there, I stayed by this job for 3 years. And I had those kids for 3 years, and they were slum kids, and every one of them, I think every one of them, without exception, has turned out to be somebody. From a librarian, a pilot, a doctor, a leader at one time of the Democratic Party in the Alaskan Senate, and so on, so on. Every one of these kids. And I attribute it not to myself, but to the fact that there was a person who took a personal interest in these kids for over a period.
Sure.
Very formative period, from about 12 to 15. Well, Julian Bryan, one of those years, he got a chance to go and tour Russia. And he thought, gee, this is great, and I guess he was unmarried at the time. And somebody said, well, why don't you take a movie camera with you? He said, I don't know anything about taking movies. So he bought himself a movie camera and got instruction in how to use it. And that started him off on this, and he had this, and it was very successful. But his pictures were always characterized by this human interest and a lot of kids.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because I didn't know that before this interview, and I think reflecting on Brian's film work, that explains a whole lot of the way he...
And then I had maybe a half year at Union before I switched entirely over to Teachers College, Columbia. But he had that, and he had all these people with keen interests in social problems.
Right. At Teachers College, your
mission is, and go at it again, and hundreds take the generals, and there will be quite a good many in each of the areas. I tried an educational site and decided this was really not my interest, although I took a good many courses in that. And incidentally, then I got a Naomi Norsworthy Fellowship, which gave me support for I guess it was my second year there. And my wife and I had both finished our MA the first year at Teachers College. We both finished our MA. Then she got a job teaching in a girls' school in New York, and I got a fellowship, so we decided to get married and order completely. We were very modern in that sense, and have been ever since.
You met your wife Margaret while you were there at Teachers College, Columbia.
Yes, we met in a discussion group related to the huge class in philosophy of education taught by William Hurd Kilpatrick. I might say, by the way, at Columbia, to try to get into classes of people whose names were quite well known. I had Harold Rugg and William Hurd Kilpatrick, and Bagley a little, and McGoy in statistics, and Helen Walker also. Well, a good many well-known people, and I thought this is very important. So I got into this Kilpatrick's class. It met in the auditorium. He was a very good lecturer. They tell lots of funny anecdotes about it. For example, he was talking about the fact that you shouldn't raise your voice in anger with children, but should try to understand them. And while he was talking, some kids came up in the balcony of Horace Mann Auditorium and were walking through from one side to the other and were making a lot of noise. And so he said, you should be very gentle with children. And will you children up there please get out of here? 1 to 3 on Mondays and Wednesdays, and in this corner, and so forth and so forth. And so it happened that Margaret Carey and KeithTyler landed in the same assemblage group, and as we were meeting together regularly throughout the semester, somehow we became involved and engaged, and ultimately got married in 1929. See, I'd gone back plus Yale, and then 1928 went back to Columbia and was there till 31. Second year then, my wife and I were married. She was teaching and had an income. I had a fellowship.
What was her teaching field?
Oh, her teaching field was English, and they had a very stiff business where you had to know your subject matter very thoroughly, be familiar with all kinds of interests, but we never collaborated, even though we approached each other. I don't know why we didn't, but we carved up the field rather than collaborating.
After you finished the doctoral study at Teachers College, did you go directly to the West Coast then?
No, I'll tell you what happened. After I tried the generals in educational psychology, I decided this really wasn't my cup of tea, and I had gotten courses then with Herbert Bruner in curriculum, who became my major advisor, and Harold Rugg in curriculum, and a fellow who came in from Denver, I can't think of his name, but he had written a number of books in the field of curriculum. And of course I took a lot of other things. I took the statistics work and various things. Well, anyway, I got very much more interested in this field, and so when it came time to take generals, about 6 of us located our interest in this field, and we were all going to take it at the same time. One was a fellow named Eisenberg, who was a Jewish student who later became a professor at the Jewish seminary in Cincinnati.
Hebrew Union.
Pardon?
Well, it's related to Hebrew Union College.
Yes,
but it's,
right.
It's
I've forgotten the name.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it was the college that he was at. And there were several other people. One of them became a great sex education expert out in California, I remember dimly. But anyway, we decided we were going at this matter of getting ready for the general systematically. And so we first collected a bibliography from all our various courses and curriculum and put it together till we had a common bibliography of, maybe 200-300 references. And then we divided this up, and then we met twice a week, or maybe 3 times a week, in the evenings. And we'd report on each one, significant findings, and critique it, not only what it purported to show, flying colors, because we really knew the stuff. And I recommend this highly as a way to get ready for generals, if you have enough students so you can have this interaction going on.
Right.
Well, after I'd taken the generals and I'd figured out my dissertation problem and presented that at a big seminar and had it approved. Been in school too long. I'm working on the side, but it's kind of make work. And I said, I'd like to get out in the field and do something along the lines of my future. Is there any way you can arrange this? And so he arranged for me to go down as a consultant where he was working in Allegheny County, Maryland. And I went down there 2 or 3 times. I set up a testing system for them. See, I'd gone on with the education. They'd pay all my expenses, but I guess I don't think I got any income for it, but it was a good experience. And I apparently endeared myself to them because then the TA, I suppose you'd say, the assistant in curriculum, here was an administrator, then assistant in curriculum, assistant in research, and assistant in tests and measurements. And then later they reorganized, and I became the right-hand man of the assistant superintendent in charge of instruction. And I was in Oakland, California. No, I'm all but dissertation type up to that. I let almost the whole 7 years go by. I did all the work. I collected all the data. I had it on cards. We didn't have computers in those days. And I hired a clerk at the Board of Education on her free time to do all the tabbing and all the nitty-gritty work after I set up the system for it and so forth. And I had all that, but getting around to knocking out the dissertation was very, very difficult. And strange, I was brought to Ohio State without my PhD. I had all but. And I was admitted as a graduate to the graduate school, you know, and I had students getting their PhD under me. And I didn't have mine. Not that this is unheard of.
Right.
But I finally, when the 7 years was approaching, I buckled down and I spent 3 weeks arduously writing the darn thing. And Duty Rotz helped me a bit on some of the statistical techniques here, because he was, like my brother, was a specialist in and this cost $600, and $600 in 1936 was like maybe at least multiplied by 3. It's maybe 2,500. Yeah, it's more than this was out of one's genes, and I was making a salary which was considered very good. I was making $4,000 a year in Oakland, and then every summer I was here again without a degree. I was visiting associate professor of education at the University of Illinois in the summers of 35, 36, 37. Wait a minute. No, 30, I beg your pardon, 31, 32, 33, no, 32, 33, 34, 35. So that every summer I'd come back from California, teach at the University of Illinois, and get that experience of teaching on a graduate level. And I had a lot of very distinguished students, by the way, that turned out very beautifully, and I still see them once in a while at Illinois. Well, so I finished the degree then.
After you'd come to Ohio State?
After I'd come to Ohio State, yeah.
Was it charters that brought you to Ohio State?
Yeah, charters brought me to Ohio State. Ed Dale had a good hand in it. I'll tell you what brought this about. I knew the people around here a bit because of my brother Ralph, and I would occasionally visit him, and so in the years that I was in Oakland, Ed Dale was working on the appreciation of motion pictures among kids, and he wanted to set up some experimental centers, and he wrote to me out in Oakland, and I said, sure, we can arrange that. So I arranged for some experimental junior high groups to where the teachers would deal with how to appreciate motion pictures using the Dale text, and then a lot of various activities, and we had planning groups. We met and planned a lot of these things. So we carried on a semester experimentation in this out in Oakland, and of course the kids just exploded. We had bulletin boards filled with pictures of movies and the inside of movies and making movies and all these kinds of things. It was a great experience. The teachers were very enthusiastic. They did this because it was fun, and they also got pats on the back from us in administration, you see, and so on.
Sure.
And it was a great experience. So we decided to culminate this in a clear appreciation, all these kinds of questions. And these kids really open up and give you all the dope if you approach them right. And we're very, I won't say permissive, that's a naughty word. Radio education research in the Bureau of Educational Research, Hillis Lumley, disappeared in Glacier National Park. He was on his vacation. He went out one morning and presumably fell in a crevice. Nobody's ever seen him since. And been out there. Ed had suggested that I was very good for this because already I had conducted some research. I did one of the earliest studies of kids listening to radio. And I made a study in the 5th, 7th, 9th, and 11th grades, kind of sort of longitudinal, and also across, trying to find out hours of listening and favorite programs and types of programs and relationships to parents in terms of supervision of listening, all kinds of, how many radios they had. Very trite study today, but I think about the first one. And we discovered it comes out just like television does today, about 2 hours and 20 minutes to 3 hours a day for these kids. More on weekends, you know, with sports. Of course, radio was the broadcast medium. There wasn't any television.
Right.
And people were making the same claims about the violence and all sorts of things. Well,
Sure.
anyway, it was an interesting study, and this had been brought back by a friend of mine to Ohio State and was published in the Proceedings of the Institute for Education by Radio Television and a couple other researchers. So apparently a year later they thought it was logical, and I was brought back here to be looked over in the spring, and I attended the 1935 Institute, which was run by Dale and Charters because Lumley had disappeared. And I received an invitation to come back here, again at, I think it was $4,000 for the regular year, and then I cooked up a project and got some support from the Rockefeller Foundation and that I paid myself $1,500 for the summer. So I had the magnificent salary of $5,500, which in those days was really good. We had a live-in maid. We lived in a style that you can't live today. We have many more machines than we had then, but the style we lived in, you couldn't live that way today.
Yeah, it's intriguing that international students who come over who still have household help available and so on in their own countries find our mechanized style of living to be just very painful. They have to work harder, they say, and
I have a little truism there that I use both abroad and here. It's becoming less true because developing countries are developing. But it used to be that in developing countries, labor is cheap. In fact, almost doesn't cost anything. You could rent but of course it was a paternalistic system, and we were exploiting them, and it's much better this way, even though nobody can afford a maid anymore.
Right. How
it developed. Well, I was there, and any problems about curriculum were referred to me, and this Oakland at that time was about the same size as Columbus is. I mean, at that time it was about 350,000 or something of the sort. We had quite a decent school system, supposed to be very progressive. We had wonderful artwork and all sorts of things, and we treasured, this is irrelevant, but we treasured the artwork done by the Orientals. We had lots of Japanese, and that was before World War II. Well, we had a very good school system of a kind of traditional sort. And so the Hearst newspaper in San Francisco owned a radio station, I think it was KPO. And somebody induced them, maybe in San Francisco, to put on a daily news broadcast for kids, which would be listened to in school. And so the young man in charge of that over in the Hearst News, but getting surface reactions and all these sorts of things. So that was a study I did, and that also was reported back in Columbus, where they had every year a report of research going on in the radio education field. Well, that started me interested. That led then to my saying, well, if we're having these results in school, what is the out-of-school thing doing? So that's why I planned that other study. But of course I never thought of going into it full-time until I was asked to come here. Before I came back, I guess in 35, or it might have been a 34. But anyway, they were doing a lot of that hard-nosed psychological research and so forth. But I was interested in more practical kinds of research, impact on schools and extent of use, and how did you fit it into the curriculum and so forth. So with some encouragement from Ralph, who already had a project supported by the General Education Board, I cooked up a project to evaluate the effectiveness of school broadcasting, which is now beginning to develop around the country. And we call it the Evaluation of School Broadcast Project. And we decided that one of the main goals would be the development of effective arena.
Sure.
But so we got the people that were doing things in Chicago and Oakland and Los Angeles County, not the city, they weren't doing much, Atlanta, well, I forget, but we got together, Detroit, all these people that were beginning to pioneer in radio broadcasting. Chicago, I mentioned, I guess. And so we held a workshop at Bronxville at the same time the 8-year study had a workshop. So the two were side by side, meeting at the college. Even forget the name of the college. The famous women's college. And then I'd get these people from the networks to come out, and we'd play experimental programs, and we'd talk about this and that and the other. And we had, it was all developed with general sessions and playing recordings. These were 16-inch transcriptions, and discussing them, and then having work sessions developing plans for the use of radio in their different school systems, and plans for evaluation. And we added to our staff somebody in social studies, somebody in literature, somebody in music, and so on, to help develop evaluation in each of these fields, try to find out what broadcasting was doing. So that's how I got into it. Then, as another interest back here, I think charters had something to do with this originally, but I probably taught the only course in radio education in the United States.
When did that start?
Well, the same period.
Right when you first came
36 or so, 35, 36. Now, we donated our services to the Department of Education. We were in the Bureau. And then charters...
That was the Bureau of Educational Research and Service.
No, it was just research.
It was just research then.
That's right.
Service came later.
Bureau of Educational Research. And also Payne Fund, had furnished the money for this. And in fact, I was on the Payne Fund for a while till we got it on the regular budget. But the Payne Fund also was helping to support the Ohio School of the Air, which was in the State Department of Education of Ohio, not at the university. And Ben Darrow was the individual behind that.
When did that start, the Ohio School for the Air, or School of the Air?
Of the Air. I would guess around 1929
so it was
or 30, because the Institute was started in broadcasting. From commercial, because we later had the American School of the Air, we had the Damrosch Music Appreciation programs on NBC, and so forth. And so Ben Darrow used to complain, you see, that we needed to develop good scriptwriters who could write educational shows and dramatic shows and so forth. So we had a little extra money, and so I went out and sort of canvassed the field and brought here a guy named Meredith Page, who was a professional scriptwriter and had some college background. Very interesting chap. And he started this first workshop in training professionals for broadcasting. I don't think they had any courses anywhere. And in this was Lawrence and Lee were the two of the students, and my wife took it. That's
Margaret
how she got it.
Ah.
And I saw Lawrence the other day when he was here. He's on the board of the Friends of the Libraries. I don't know whether he's on the board, but he's a member. And he right away said to me, you got me started. It lasted 2 years. I guess we ran out of money, and Meredith Page went somewhere else. But it was very successful. And he, being big-time stuff, he went down to Cincinnati and arranged for a regular weekly series called Men Who Made America. These were biographical dramas. And then in the United States, and they had a huge orchestra, everything.
Yeah.
This was a plush operation. And they produced these, and then later they were fed to the Blue Network.
Oh.
So, see, they had Red and Blue of NBC, and so my wife wrote a couple of those, and they were on the Blue Network, and of course Lawrence wrote some, and Lee, and all these people. I don't know who the rest of the people were, but it'd always say it was so-and-so and Meredith Page, but it was a professional job and professionally enacted down there, and those were the great days of radio.
That's an excellent model. I think one of the things our students miss today is that kind of apprenticeship with a master.
Precisely. It's a wonderful idea, and that's what we... heavens, I talk as if I could still... I guess his name was Clifford. I think that's his... That's either his first or last name in my point. But anyway, the state superintendent embraced this, and it was supported by legislative appropriation. After the initial starting of it. What the Payne Fund did was originally to demonstrate, and the first Ohio School of the Air was going to be national. Well, originally they tried to get a national School of the Air under educators' auspices. I don't know whether you know this story or not, and they tried to get the AASA, which in those days was called the Department of Superintendents of the National Education Association, to endorse it. And one of my students has written a dissertation on Mr. Darrow, and you'll find all the...
Oh.
And so then the Payne Fund said, well, if we can't do it nationally, let's try it regionally. They had a series government by those who govern, and they ran a line into the NEA in Washington, equipped a little studio there, and they'd bring in cabinet members from, who was it, Hoover then? I don't know who it was, whoever the president was, but they brought in, United States government was very dull and very stiff, but nevertheless, the attraction of schools, you can tune in and hear for schools only, these great men on radio, you see. So it was that's the way it got started, and then that convinced the legislature that it was worth putting in a couple of $100,000 a year, or whatever they put into it originally.
This was, though, broadcast on the regular WLW transmitter, AM...
That's right. It was only AM, that's all it was. 500 kWs in the daytime, and of course daytime was relatively unsold.
Yeah.
There was a lot of time on the day.
So the school really could have access to the...
That's right. And
facility.
they had a half an hour a day. I believe it was 1:30 to 2 every day. Then they began to get some series contributed by Ohio State, and we would originate at WOSU. They had a long aerial down there just right for the kilocycles of WOSU, and they would pick us up in Cincinnati, and you know, this would be a 15-minute show for high school students to get them to discuss similar problems in their
Is this
classes.
where the junior town meeting kind of came
Well,
from?
this may have been where the idea came from. I didn't realize you knew all about the junior town meeting, but later the American located at Columbus, and they became convinced that the way to get more of their papers sold, to approach this narrowly. They didn't say this will sell more of our papers, they said it'll sell more of anybody's papers, but of course we'll benefit. And if Scholastic wants to benefit too, fine. So on that grounds, we were able to get educators into an organization. They came to me. Well, originally they formed the organization, but they had me because of the radio interest.
The actual name of this discussion group was the Junior Town Meeting League.
And then on ABC for some time, called America's Town Meeting of the Year, with George V. Denny Jr. as moderator. And so they wanted to tie into that, and the idea was, let's get junior town meetings going on radio. Later we tried it in television, but let's get junior town meetings going in high schools all around the country, either broadcast or not broadcast, but the same general technique used by the America's Town Meeting of the Year. That is to say, have a panel of youth who prime themselves on the topic and take different viewpoints, have a moderator, use your PA system in the high school, assemble the kids in the auditorium, then have questions from the audience, you see. So you get active discussion going, and the idea of this is, if they are really discussing contemporary issues and controversial matters, this will lead to the youngsters wanting to read their local newspapers, and also these high school newspapers published by American Education Press and by Scholastic. That was we always pulled in then. We went at the power people. So we had breakfast every year at the American Association of School Administrators, and we invited in the prominent superintendents of schools from Chicago, New York. Bill Jansen from Chicago, I mean from New York, I forget who's Chicago, but they'd come into these breakfasts every year, and we'd talk about the Junior Town Meeting League, and they'd tell what was going on. Use these people, I shouldn't say I wanted to use them, I wanted to call upon them to give their services to support educational television in the United States. So we had a little workshop. We always met in Atlantic City. Well, we didn't always. One year we met in Cleveland and so forth, but usually in Atlantic City at the Haddon Hall. And then we'd work all day Saturday discussing the particular topic of that year. And I led this discussion, and we'd lay it out on the blackboard and see all the aspects and get everything in. And then at the end of the day on Saturday, judging by how they had contributed, I would make assignments of this outline, so that each person had to write a section. And then they'd sit up half the night on Saturday night and write it right then and there. And then the next morning, we'd spend all Saturday morning till 1 o'clock or so reviewing it. And everybody'd read their contribution, we'd make suggestions. Then we'd ask them to fix it up a little more, and then they'd submit their weekend. And good stuff. We had real people. Alan Griffin of Ohio State was especially good at writing this kind of thing. We'd use other people when appropriate. We'd use Ed Dale sometimes, but we'd use people from anywhere in the country who were good at whatever the topic was. These would be such as handling controversial issues in the classroom. Or another one was controversial discussion on television, and or youth discussion on television, that's what it was called. But every year we had one of these pamphlets. I still have a bunch of them. They're still very good pamphlets. They're excellent material. Of course, none of our young people were broadcasting in the broad sense of the term. And it had been started in 1930 under a grant of $5,000, I guess, by the Payne Fund. And they brought in people from Britain and Canada and the United States to look at the possibilities of radio for educational purposes. And when I came in the fall of '35, I started planning for the 1936 one. Of course, one was to give an opportunity for issues to be discussed in the field. Second, and a third, I believe, was to encourage research in this field. Those were our three emphases. Now, we said there will be no groups such as the Junior League, which supported this very strongly, and they're a powerful group of young matrons with good power base in their own communities. The result of this was, one, it was the one place in the whole community where in the whole society where under neutral auspices these people could get together. They could have arguments and fights if you wanted to, but the Institute took no sides. Their job was to provide an arena, and they did come. The commercial broadcasters came, of course, to preserve their image, to satisfy the FCC or whatever reasons. But they also sent the people in their own organizations who were doing educational broadcasting. And these people, of course, were really interested in it, and they were the ones who would be exchanging ideas and techniques and so on. Two things developed out of the Institute. One is that a lot of these groups that we identified and brought together, and we'd have a special interest group for agricultural broadcasts, for women's programs, for children's programs, for news broadcasters, and so forth. A lot of these formed their own national organizations, and now, of course, we like to say that was the umbrella, and they needed also this cross-cultural fertilization. So that even if they had their own organization, a lot of them still came. The second thing I think we did is to found the very first year, I guess, we founded the Ohio State Awards, which we called the American Exhibition of Educational Radio Programs. We called it an exhibition because we didn't want to encourage cutthroat competition so much as the idea, let us locate uniquely outstanding programs and exhibit them so people can see what constitutes a good program. A year ago, I gave the talk at the award presentation at Ohio State in which I reviewed the 40-year history of that organization. And I went back to the proceedings and got a lot of historical information. For example, one of the original judges was Felix Green, who became a famous China person. So much so that for a while the United States government, he was persona non grata. And so his films used to be distributed in Canada, and then they'd get down to the United States. But he was the North American local station. It was Joe Reese representing WLW Cincinnati. Well, we had a lot. In those days, the idea was you have a preliminary institute. And the Institute, of course, one of the other things that flowed into the Institute were the fact that due to our project, which is going on simultaneously, this research project, where we had some money and where we traveled all over the country and we brought people into workshops, we developed quite a active group or network or whatever you want to call them of people in top positions in school systems who are doing school broadcasting. And these people, of course, attended the Institute, and that would be another group to be identified, the school broadcasters at the Institute. But these people, a and a half ago, Jim McAndrew in New York, he's retired. He was head of radio and television in the New York City Public Schools, which included a television station and a radio station and a tremendous movement among the schools, like the all-city high school radio workshop, which produced people. And I think the original study we did identified these people, gave them encouragement and recognition. Then they became the leaders, and of course they attended the Institute, so we got together frequently.
In addition to the kind of formal relationship at the Institute, there was...
Everybody knew each other.
Yeah.
They had all kinds of workshops, and then not only the things we promoted, but later somebody would get a grant to promote something and all these same people would be there because these were the people who were doing things in radio and later television. And so that raised the question, how did we get television?
Right.
Well, that again is chance, and chance enters into so many things. I don't know just how the Federal Communications Commission to come out and get educated about the educational side of broadcasting. They saw commercial broadcasters all the time, but educators used to come out to the Institute just to see what was being talked about and what was going on. And when we'd have people like Wayne Call, a new commissioner, a lawyer from the east side of New York, who was very cause-minded and very politically ambitious. Frieda Hennig came out to the Institute and was very impressed. She met the junior leaguers, she met Catholic sisters, she met all kinds of lay people as well as the professionals. And she said to herself, this is my cause. I'm going to make this a cause. This is how I will get known in this new job of mine. And about that same time, maybe she called attention to it, I don't know, but the NAEB, the National Association of Educational Broadcasters, and the 1948, this was now in the spring of 1950. There had been this freeze on. What had happened was they had started to grant licenses for television, and they had discovered that they'd placed the stations too close together in distance, and there was a good deal of interference. So what happened was that in 1948 the Commission decided that from an engineering standpoint they didn't have enough data and they were putting stations too close together. Also they found out there was going to be much more demand for television than they thought possible. Television from the vantage point of radio looked like a very expensive undertaking, and it was assumed that there would not be more than maybe 150, 200 stations in the country. And here all of a sudden people were putting in applications. All this freeze was on, which was originally for a year and then 2 years and so forth. We got alerted, we educators who'd been passing all kinds of resolutions. That's very interesting too, because the chairman of the radio committee and later the Radio Television Committee of both the Land Grant College Association and the American Association of American Universities was Howard L. Beavis, our president. And he used to ask me to write his report, so our resolutions are always up to date, and they always got passed unanimously by the association. But the smart people said, this doesn't really make any impression on the FCC. You've got to get down and do something, Institute or whatever I represent. But there were no, and the Office of Education, and I would say there were about 12 of us, or maybe 15. And the general idea is we all agreed we ought to make representations, and we'd have to dig it out of our own universities or public school systems' pockets for the expense and all that kind of thing. I guess Frieda Hennig was there, the commissioner, and she said, this is a great cause and we ought to do something about it, and the commission won't pay any attention to you unless you do. The Institute comes in May, and I thought to myself, this is fall. And I can probably free myself up at Ohio State, and maybe I can get the president, since he's so committed to this now through my resolutions.
All those reports.
Yeah, I said maybe I can get him to release, or not release me, but to first. And we decided the first thing we needed was a lawyer. And Frieda Hennig, again, this politician, she said, well, he was the chief prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials for the Army. And but before that, he was a chief counsel of the Federal Communications Commission. And he really knows his way around, and he's with this very dedicated law firm on Wall Street. And it just might be that this would interest him. He's back now. He wants to get an image and a publicity, and he might just do this. So Belmont and Farley and I got on the train and went up to New York and went to see Telford Taylor. And we told him what this was going to mean for education, and here was our chance to get channels. And of course, he knew all this background.
Sure.
Waited on tenterhooks for a week or so, and then he said, we'll do it. We said nothing about money. And then Belmont and I went to the only two organizations we knew. We went to the NEA and the American Council on Education, and each one of them gave us $7,500, and we'll pay. So that on that basis, then, we had a council, and my job was to locate witnesses, because I had all these contacts with superintendents of schools. I could furnish Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New Orleans, almost any of these places. I knew them all. We played all the angles.
Right.
And then the University of Chicago furnished their lobbyist, and he knew his way around Congress. And so he lined up senators and representatives. One of these you like to hear from, you know. And so we had Democrats and Republicans. We had senators and representatives. We had AAUW. We had the PTA. We had labor. We had manufacturers. Everybody, because, again, chance. This was the time when... and all these stories were in the newspapers about the horror of television. And so we came at just the right time. And we had no opposition. Now, the original hearings in 1935, when the commission had ordered there to be hearings as to whether there should be channels in radio, reserved frequencies in radio, at that time the educational establishment was divided. Even Norman Thomas testified it wasn't necessary and that he got plenty of time on the air, and so forth. A very divided front, and the lay organizations were divided. But in 1950 and 51, we were united. There practically no off the air, and those who didn't wanted them. So NAB made a very weak stand. I see important people in the hearings all came from Ohio State. Frank Stanton, the director of research of NAB, was a former professor of, over in marketing at Ohio State. His name was Baker, and unfortunately he got a severe beating that caused him to have to resign from NAB. Did you ever hear that story?
No, no.
Well, one day, just in the late afternoon, the NAB put their research director on the stand to testify. And he had a paper. And he distributed this paper as is customary. He had 20 copies, so we all got the copies of this. And after he got on the stand, he made some extemporaneous remarks before he read his paper, and Frieda Hennig started in on him. And this colloquy went back and forth for a while until time for adjournment. So we had overnight to read his paper. And he had done very amateurish statistical work. And we looked up his sources. So the next day, this guy reads his paper, and then when it came to cross-examination or whatever it is, Telford tore that guy to shreds. And really, literally, pieces of flesh all quivering all over the floor. So much so that the commercial broadcasters were so ashamed of his performance that nobody would speak to him. And that noon, it just happened, Frieda Hennig had a luncheon in her offices for all of the parties in this trial, both sides, you see. Here we were all there, and there was Baker, and nobody would speak to him. They were so ashamed. They didn't know what to say to the guy because he had done these well, that didn't do them any good. But all I was trying to say is Another witness for them was a guy who'd got his MA with me, and he was the educational director of the KMBC in Kansas City. This is the big local Mormon outfit out there, very much in the money. Of course, he was their educational director. He was testifying how they gave plenty of time.
Sure.
And by the way, we got this on the record later when I worked in Kansas City. We used this to get time on KMBC. Well, anyway, a lot of these people were from Ohio State.
Dick Hull was with the NAEB at that point?
Yes, Dick Hull was representing NAEB, and was at that strategy meeting. Yes, indeed.
He'd come from Iowa.
Iowa. He was at WOI, Iowa State, and they pioneered quite an operation. And since it was non-profit, you can't say they made a lot of money, but all the money they made, they plowed back
in.
Yeah, right.
And then it was after that time that he came to Ohio State.
Yes, right. After we got a station, that was about 54, I guess. Well, what happened then, we had the hearings, and we worked with the commission when it became fairly clear that they were going to grant channels. They asked our help in where should these channels be located, and so we developed a formula which the commission agreed upon, the staff of the commission agreed upon informally, which was there would be a reserve channel in every metropolitan area by census definition, plus any educational center where there's a big university or something of that sort. And so we took a map in the census book and went through and located every one of those for the commission. We missed a couple too.
Oh dear!
I think we missed Michigan State or something. But anyway, we located all of these and on the map, and then the commission came out granting the original 242 channels, I believe it was. Maybe it's 212. But all the commercial people said the educational establishment can never support it. And we said that's why we need channels, because it takes time for educators. They're slow moving. This is a growth. We said, this is the national forests. This is the national parks. We're preserving for 5 stations in operation, and the commercial people only have about 500. And the educational establishment is very much in the picture and is very solvent. In that very period, on a interview with New Republic, I remember, and they'll support it.
Right.
And they'll always be hard up for money. They'll have to make drives every year, but this is the way it's going to be. You're right. That's absolutely right.
And certainly in this day and age, a lot more people than probably we ever dreamed do.
For educational purposes, but attractively to a much broader audience, such as Sesame Street and now some of the upstairs, downstairs, and a lot of things like that. By the way, which is a conscience group that was formed by a lot of atomic scientists who'd been engaged in making the atom bomb and were stricken with conscience, and they had this organization to see that the atom developments, well, it's similar to the people now who are concerned about the nuclear fission and so on. Well, anyway, here was this big organization started supporting us. In fact, they went gung-ho with the help of NAEB, who gave them a lot of suggestions, and Dick Hall and others. But they formed several organizations. One was the National Citizens Committee, which used a lot of people that had been in the Eisenhower campaign, good old Republican capitalists, and they got support in every one of these 242 communities. The idea was to get industrial and wealthy support. And then we had the thing that I'd named the Joint Committee on Educational Television, representing 7 educational organizations. This is the mechanism we used, and I was chairman of it. That later became the Joint Council. But it's the same idea. It got permanent support then from the Ford Foundation. And we, at that time, developed a consulting staff. We had Paul Reed of Rochester and myself and the guy who later headed up the station in New York, but about 15 or 20 consultants. And we'd go out on call to any of these 242 communities and meet with the Chamber of Commerce and so forth. I remember going up to Milwaukee, where the Hearst boys were fighting us because to do that. Well, we had this big community meeting when we were fighting, and here was the adult education place that was going to get the license, and here a friend of mine from the Hearst station in Baltimore was there, and I was there making a speech and so forth, and we were on opposite sides, you know. We all agreed on the...
In the midst of all these activities related to the Institute for Education by Radio and Television and the development of educational television, World War II intervened, and that seems to have been a major force in the lives of everyone in that era, but certainly educational professionals were very involved. What happened to you in relation?
Anyway, it began to look as though some of us might be drafted, and certainly that maybe we ought to give our services to the government. And so I went down to the local recruiting people and tried to size up the situation. I had always been 1 year over draft age. When it was 25 to 35, or 21 to 35, I was 36. And so I went around to the recruiting place, and they said, we think we can get you a majority, and you would work in fields similar to what you're working in here, either in education or perhaps in broadcasting. And then I went around and talked to Judith Waller and a lot of wise people in the business, and they said, well, what you're doing here is really very important because you're trying to get the broadcast people to give their all to the war effort and for morale and all these things, and so you don't have to be worried about it, whether you're doing your bit. Well, nevertheless, I sort of made up my mind that if I did get a major commission, I would accept it. And one day I got a letter, hot breath of impending draft had been stronger, I would have probably taken it, but I deliberated a long time and decided that was not really that important for me. And so we had continued the Institute. We dropped it 1 year because they were urging us not to have convention travel. I forget what year that was. Probably that was 45, just before the war ended. So, but we did. We had this themes, broadcasting in the war effort or something like that, and we put a lot of attention in studying the problem. We were really interested in what broadcasting could do for morale, and so we had Norman Corwin out here and Arch Obler and so on, talking about what radio could do in the war effort. After the war, I was asked by the War Department to join a group of educators, including Dean Cottrell of Ohio State, to go over as, I guess he came over in a later group, but anyway, the first group went over to look over the educational establishment in occupied Germany, in the American zone, and see what needed to be done. I was asked to go over to look at broadcasting. Now, there'd been a preliminary group that had gone over in the fall of, or sometime in 46, and tried to look at the educational establishment and get the schools operating again. They'd been closed for about a year in Germany, kids just roaming the streets. But this was during the period when nobody knew what the Nazis might do. They might spring up and all that. But by the fall of 46, things were quieted down. They sent over an exploratory party, mostly administrators. Then we were the first working group that went over. We went over in a C-54, bucket seats, no insulation, and bundled up, flying the Atlantic. First time most of us had ever flown the Atlantic. In fact, we got short snorter bills. You don't know what this is, but everybody that flew the Atlantic in those days, snorter bill. This was something that developed during the war. Well, we flew to Frankfurt, and we spent 90 days in the American zone, also visited some of the other zones, I looked over broadcasting and also film. And later I became a member of the panel on education in occupied countries of UNESCO, and was asked back in 1950 to be a member of a workshop in social studies, also seeing the connections with radio and audiovisual aids. Later, went over on a mission for the State Department. That's the Egyptian bit, and then around the Orient and various countries. Yes, I would say that from a academic interest in international affairs, that experience in Germany in the occupation, and other visits as a tourist after that, and then going on this mission and living in Egypt, all of these things contribute to a very strong international interest on my part.
You did some work in Kuwait as well?
Well, the second time we were in Egypt, we were asked to make, we did two missions that the State Department requested. One was a 3-week mission in Kuwait, and another one was in Baghdad.
Oh.
Baghdad is pretty hard for Americans to get in these days. They're very anti-American, but at that time they were still playing ball with us. Kuwait, of course, the Disneyland of the Arab world with Social Security, I guess is the way I termed it.
Yeah. You also did work in the Orient.
On the way back from Egypt, we were requested to spend varying periods of time in a number of Asian countries where the ministry requested our services. Hong Kong and Japan and the Philippines, Manila. We also stopped in Bangkok, but they gave us 4 or 5 days there, but not really official.
The thing that, of course, we've ignored in all this is the legacy of students that you trained. Talking about all these other matters, I guess it wouldn't be obvious that you were a professor all that time and did indeed profess.
I trust I practiced as well as professing. Yes, all the time and we voluntarily taught courses, and I conducted seminars. I don't remember whether Dale did or not, but I always then from that I would occasionally get students getting their degrees with me. But in both ways, and remember, this is one of the few courses in educational broadcasting in the country at that time. And that way I got a lot of pioneer leadership. And also national and international organizations would send people here. We got from the National Council of Churches in their foreign arm, we got a number of people sent here to train them. One is Bernardis, who's been in the Philippines ever since, and just this year is back in the United States.
About how many PhD students do you think you would have graduated over the career?
Well, you know, I've been trying to figure this out. I don't know. I didn't become full-time in instruction until, 10 years ago? You know, it must have been about 12, 13 years ago. So how many, you mean PhDs?
Yeah, PhDs.
I don't know for sure. I would guess somewhere between 40 and 50. I don't know.
It's still a big number.
It's a big number.
Especially considering all the other kinds of things that you did. One kind of thing that we might be able to just touch on today is how do you see the future of educational broadcasting? Do you think that the video disc is going to be a big breakthrough, or is or is that just another evolutionary step? Is cable and two-way kinds of things going to make a big impact on the way in which we perceive the use of the electronic media?
Lawrence Kremen, the president of Teachers College, was in Columbus at Ohio State recently, and was pointing out a very, I thought, important point, which is that education is to be distinguished from schooling. And the educational establishment varies according to the times and in historical development. In the present time, the educational influences, the most important one is television. And then there are others. The family has diminished greatly. The church has diminished greatly. The school is still pretty important. Well, what I'm trying to say is I think in the same way, if we look at, as educators, at all of the possibilities of broadcasting technology, we see we have to take into account the impact of out-of-school television upon youngsters and what we do about it in the school, because we are teachers. We have to train people to man that establishment to see that there are educational things going on.
Right.
We have to look at technology used in these various ways, whether they're video disc or videotape or closed circuit distribution television scheduled at regular times, because that makes things possible. But I think these may be recorded and replayed within the confines of the new copyright legislation, which I've been looking at.
Right.
But anyway, I think that we still need some of these forms, but we have to look at the whole picture and not just say what's going to happen to regularly scheduled instructional broadcasting. I don't know. It may change, but I think there'll still be some. But I think a lot of these other forms. Of course, the use of these media simply as opportunities for expression or for as in a sense testing media to see how well you're doing things by recording and looking at yourself or recording and hearing yourself.
Right.
All these are possibilities. When you talk about it,
Gadgets.
that's right.
The
Gadgets are enablers, and that's why I insist, if you really want to back me down, that my real field is curriculum. And audio, visual, educational media, instructional television and radio, all these things are only means to an end.
Well, on June the 2nd, 1977, this has been an interview with KeithTyler at The Ohio State University.